South Africa is definitely in a precarious position. We are being threatened by the US. Some of the social funding has been withdrawn from South Africa, and it looks imminent that we will lose the AGOA deal with the US. That seems to be a fact that seems to be coming into view, that Donald Trump won't extend AGOA, I'd imagine. We also have problems within the Government of National Unity, where the ANC has crossed every red line that the GNU partners had set for the Government of National Unity. Everything seems to be up in the air at the moment, and the only response we've heard so far from our president has been to tell America to keep his America while we keep our Zimbabwe, because that's what it sounded like. But to tell us a lot more is South Africa's preeminent analyst on these issues, from Frans Cronje, Private Clients, the man himself, Dr. Frans Cronje. Frans, welcome back.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, Frans, you're not here a moment too soon. What the hell is going on? Let's start off with the last time we spoke to you was just in the aftermath of the US elections. Yeah. Did you foresee the Trump administration taking such a tough line on our sort of provoking of the poking of the bear that
Yes.
we've been doing for the last 20 years?
Well, firstly, we got the call right here.
We did.
Remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, that was very good. On that Trump was going to win. And yes, we foresaw this as well. And we think we understand what it is. So I'll try to translate it, because no one else in the country seems to understand Trump.
Right.
A chap put it to me yesterday very well. Take him seriously, but not necessarily literally. The Americans think South Africa is very important because it's one of 3 points, the naval base at Simonstown is the specific point, that anchor control of the Indo-Pacific. Simonstown's one point, the old Southern Sea route. The next point is somewhere along the sort of coast around Djibouti, where the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait narrows into the Red Sea before the Suez Canal. As the Houthis have shown, with rudimentary weapons, you can cause all sorts of mayhem and redirect global shipping. America used to have a dominant naval facility at Djibouti. 15 years or so after that, China got a naval facility there, and you will learn in the imminent future that Russia has a naval facility somewhere near Suakin in Sudan. So American dominance is challenged at Djibouti. So number 1 point, Simonstown. We're going to get back there. Number 2, Djibouti. The third point on the triangle is right the way east across the entire expanse of the Indian Ocean. And off the west coast of Australia, the Solomon Islands, which the Imperial Japanese knew was so important to hold after they'd sunk the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, to cut Australia and East Asia off from the influence of the Americans. China's diplomats, as expert as ever, have done very well at the Solomon Islands and can now, in practice, operate naval vessels from there, challenging American dominance at that little point. Draw a line from the Solomon Islands back to Simonstown. So let's just do this again. Simonstown at the bottom, 5,000 miles to the north, Djibouti, 8,000 miles to the east, the Solomon Islands, and back we've got a triangle. That triangle is the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. 50% at least plus of global trade that moves by ship moves inside that triangle. 80% of America's oil moves inside that triangle as well. Whoever controls all 3 points of the triangle has vast geostrategic influence. If South Africa is a successful country, the West could rightly aspire to having some influence over what happens at Simonstown. If South Africa collapses through low growth into populism and trauma and hell, it's probably not going to be a Western ally. So this is important. Also, just as a quick aside, in the middle of the triangle, there's an island archipelago called the Chago Islands. And the Chago Islands were a British possession, and Keir Starmer is trying to give them to Mauritius, who doesn't actually have a historical claim to them. But inside the Chago Islands is a little island called Diego Garcia. And the Americans have a military base there. And from there, they can fly nuclear-armed aircraft over the west of Australia, southern China, the Middle East, and East Africa. And they're afraid that Starmer's decision will be the beginning of the end of their access to Diego. So there's a vast amount at stake here for them in who gets possession of Simonstown. Further, he inspires his great crowning foreign policy achievement might be a zone of hegemonic American influence in the Western Hemisphere. And hence his comments on Greenland and on Canada, because that's how you get into the Western Hemisphere from the top of the world. And hence his comments on the Panama Canal, because that's how you get into the Western Hemisphere from the left of the world. The back door into the Western Hemisphere and the Atlantic, which is a Chinese and key strategic objective to access the Atlantic, is the naval base at Simonstown. So number one, these guys think South Africa is an important place in the world. A second point, as I interpret it, is that the view is that South Africa is a failing society. 1% growth, 30% unemployment. It doesn't end well. And American diplomats would probably be correct in thinking that if they want to build a sustainable relationship with South Africa, they cannot do so in an environment where the economy goes nowhere, because eventually the society is going to fail. So Trump writes an executive order. And in that executive order, if you take it not entirely literally, but rather seriously, he says three things. The first is stop screwing around with the world's worst dictatorships in a manner that we believe threatens our national security. That is different from saying you cannot talk or trade with Russia or China or Iran. You have to, of course. It's India has an excellent foreign policy. It gets on well with the Americans, well with the Russians, well with everyone. And the Americans don't think that India is threatening US national security or that of its allies. This is the critical line. So stop doing that, which would appear to be good advice. The second thing he essentially says is, if you want to succeed as a country, you're going to need to have solid property rights. And the new Expropriation Act that has been signed by Mr. Ramaphosa dilutes property rights here. Under its predecessor, if you were expropriated, you got market value plus financial compensation. So if you were a foreign investor and you came to me and you said, we're looking at South Africa, we want to put in a lot of money, and we did the due diligence, and they said expropriation, I'd say in the event that that would occur for a public purpose, which is fine, you can have an accountant and a valuer. They'd come up with a value, a court would accept it, and you'd get your investment back. The new Expropriation Act does not do that. Red herrings on nil compensation and land and things. The crux of the thing is that market value is only one factor in calculating compensation. So are things like the national interest. Now, you can only have property rights in a country if they are anchored against an objective measure of value. Market value, three accountants will come up with an average and you get your money. As soon as you dilute that, you in practice don't have property rights. And whatever you get that's less than market value is expropriation without compensation, because you're not compensated. You haven't done well as an investor to get 70% of your money back. You don't go to your shareholders and say, this is great, we got 70%. South Africa's fixed investment rate, which is what share of, measured as a share of GDP, so how much fixed investment comes into the country as a share of the size of the economy, is 15%. That is perfectly in line with a 1% economic growth rate. If we want to grow the economy at 3% and 4% and later 5%, we need to raise the fixed investment rate from 15% to at least 25% and closer to 30%. To do that, we need external parties to contribute capital to the country. They will not do this because they will do the due diligence. As some Americans might say to these South Africans who think they're going to go to Washington and explain, they'll say to them, we have read your act. We can read. Yeah. We know what's in it. So Trump says, don't do that, because you're not going to be a success. And the third thing that he said is again, not entirely literally, but seriously, is you're not going to be a very successful country if you don't put merit at the center of everything that you do in your country's economy and appoint people on the basis of that less than on the basis of race. And that is not to say that there is not room for empowerment policies that use, as they must, taxpayer funds to identify people on the socio-economic status who need assistance to get into the middle classes. Simply saying that the manner in which this has been done in South Africa has in practice taxed capital on arrival. Good example is Starlink. There isn't Starlink in South Africa because you can't jump through the BEE hurdles. So the BEE hurdle in the case of Starlink is to tax the investment. You shouldn't even tax the investment as it leaves your economy, let alone on the day that it arrives. If these, my sense of the thing is that if the South Africans meet the Americans on these 3 points, back off on things that others think threaten their national security. You can't argue that with them. They obviously know something that the rest of us wouldn't, fortunately. Second thing is secure property rights. Third thing is put merit at the top of your economy. This is not bad advice. And if the South Africans follow that and signal accordingly, because it's now show, don't tell. It's not sending another delegation to explain, which won't work with this American administration. If the South Africans signal on that by action, so let's say back off on Iran, put market value central to the expropriation law, and make it work politically, the constitution can be navigated. And thirdly, let foreign investors, exempt them from BEE, make it be explicit on it. I can perfectly foresee that within weeks, you could see a South African government leader, perhaps even Mr. Ramaphosa, in the Rose Garden in the back of the White House, shaking Mr. Trump's hand and saying, we've done the deal of the century in Africa, the greatest African deal ever done. And at an exchange rate of 20-1, which is what it is, the American dollar goes a hell of a long way in our little economy. And we could easily take a big leap towards closing that gap in the fixed investment level, taking it from 15% to 25%. Then we would grow the economy at 4%. And if we do that for 20 years time, our unemployment rate will be nearer 10% than the current 30-something. So that's how I think you should interpret Mr. Trump's interest in South Africa.
Okay, so let's square this off then, Frans, with Donald Trump's what looks like very isolationist US rhetoric, right? Your first point being that South Africa is geopolitically important, when it seems like Trump is walking back America's geopolitical influence. Is he not doing that, or is he just doing it differently?
Well, I think it depends on where in the world. I think you should distinguish. I think Trump in America in some respects beat the Republicans and the Democrats. And in the case of the Republicans, beat the neoconservative, the neocons, the old kind of Reaganites, send American military power around the world to
show them how strong we are,
to do whatever one does. And I think in the case of Trump, tariffs are an alternative to the boots of young American soldiers on the ground. They are a tool, a weapon. And I mean, as one should, the tariffs that Americans charge on their trade partners are less often than the trade partners charge to the Americans. So the accusation that Mr. Trump is starting a trade war, I don't think holds entirely together. It's simply a case of saying we don't want to be taken advantage of. And the sense is the funding of NATO, which is not a trade thing, defense issue. But very much the sense was we were being taken advantage of. We don't wish to be taken advantage of. And I don't think it's isolationist, not when you try and dominate the Western Hemisphere as a hegemonic zone of influence. It's the opposite of being isolationist. And there's a very strong understanding amongst the right people that the back door into the Western Hemisphere is Simonstown. And that must be covered because the Americans are not doing well in the Indo-Pacific. They are losing influence to their global rivals, and hence South Africa has importance here for the relationships. I did a call earlier this morning with an investment bank, and we had this discussion. At the end of it, I said to them, you know what? If you see it like this. The South African mainstream media has interpreted Trump's comments as an attack on the country. But if you see it in the way that I've tried to explain it to you, then the interests of the Americans, the Trump Americans, and even the ANC are not that misaligned. The ANC is doing well here now relative to a year ago. We'll talk about this later. The EFF is nowhere, the MK nowhere, the DA no. It's red and it's green and it's blue rivals. It's been masterful in how it's battered them down and sent them into a tough tiz. If the ANC's numbers are getting back to 50%, we saw 46 at the end of last year. I get data tomorrow. I don't know what it is, but if it was nearer 50. I wouldn't be surprised. But for the ANC to then get back to 50 and hold itself at a national majority and govern the country successfully, it does need to raise the growth rate. And to raise the growth rate, it does need to fracture this near consensus on policy in the country. That we don't need to make profound moves because we kind of get on with a 1% growth rate, and that's not too bad because at least it's not doomsday in the EFF and the MK. But in the longer term, you do get to doomsday. And it's a wonderful opportunity then in some respects for the ANC to say, look, these Americans are being terribly difficult, but you know that there's nothing really we can do about it. And capitulate. You might not diplomatic, you might use a different word. Because in following Mr. Trump's advice, the ANC actually now has a realistic prospect at not just restoring its national majority, but holding it for another generation. And this past decade culminating in the 40% defeat would be a
turning point.
A turning point of sorts.
Now, how do you marry that, Frans, with the ANC's rather strident response to the American to those executive orders?
Yes,
I mean, it hasn't been we thinking about it. It's been go to hell. It's keep your Britain and we'll keep our Zimbabwe. It's been that kind of language. So it's not like they even, you mentioned India before, where they've obviously dealt with these situations quite pragmatically. It doesn't even seem like there's any entertaining of these issues.
There isn't at a formal level. In the background, there are some people who, if it's put to them, you see, if you put it to people in the way that the mainstream media does, that this is an attack on sovereignty, or even the DA falls for that and says, well, it will go to Washington to tell Trump the truth. And what truth? Your economy grows at 1%. You have a 30% unemployment rate.
You called it the expropriation.
This is your truth.
Yeah. You're telling us this thing we called the expropriation.
If you see it that way, then yes, you will get that reaction. But I think if you read it slightly differently, you might be able to pull out a different reaction. And where that has happened in private, and it hasn't happened a lot, but where it has happened in private, I find that the people who've heard it have reconsidered what this actually represents. It's not a threat; it's an opportunity, and it's a rare opportunity. And it's one that can snap us out of this consensus. Now, Maletsi Mbeki made a comment recently, I saw it on YouTube, and he said essentially that the tragedy of the GNU is that the ANC and the DA are not that different on policy. They broadly go along with each other, as they have done. And what that means, he said, that the tragedy of it is that there's no one in the government that can force through there can be an inflection point for the reforms necessary to get the growth rate to where it needs to be to eliminate the unemployment rate. And I don't see a domestic inflection point for reform. What would it be? The business community won't be it. And I have sympathy for that. It's not business's job to govern an entire country and reset its ideological trajectory. The political opposition is plainly unable to do it. The ANC is stuck in its old kind of difficult, factionalized, ideologically loaded, hegemonic structures. The civil society, there are a few groups, they do very good work, but they don't have the heft to shift it. So if you don't have a domestic source to trigger and force reform, dramatic reform, which is what this entails, well, then you must look outside. And there is one. So maybe the intelligent thing to do would be to try and take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And to, on the back channel, say, right, we do hear you. We want something out of this too. We need fixed investment at 25% of GDP by the end of this exercise. How can you help us achieve that? And that aligns with America's regional interests. Because if South Africa is a high-growth economy with a growing middle class, that middle class will very likely, as the aspirant middle class already does, aspire to essentially Western values. And then South Africa is a sustainable long-term partner for the Western world. We also have good relations with China and Russia. I always say that. I don't have the same fundamental problems with these countries as some of my more fervent colleagues might. But then we become a successful country. So in this crisis, there is an opportunity to seize. And if it is seized by people with the right foresight and strategic thinking ability, 6 weeks' time, the Rose Garden might see something very different to what we're seeing now.
Because if the current issues has done one thing, it's to shine a light into our very dark corners, is to make grown people stand up and say, no, we called it the Expropriation Act, but it's not the Expropriation Act. We call it race-based legislation. We call it BEE, but it's actually not race-based legislation, and defend the indefensible, which is kind of where the same position that the National Party were put into in the 70s. Defend this bad stuff.
And I think one thing that the ANC might have found difficult over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, is that Western diplomats for 30 or 40 years kind of didn't make an issue. It kind of went along with things. And now they've run into a type of Western actor that they'd never previously confronted. Because this isn't the old neocons, who are also sometimes very soft on South Africa, or the Democrats who were always sometimes indulgent of South Africa. And so this takes a bit of getting used to. I would think it's a bit jarring. For 30 years you've had your way. Now someone tells you no. But there is some potential here if this opportunity is seized and utilized in the correct measure. Of course, there's a flip side. Because if that is not done, there are consequences. The first, without any help from the Americans, South Africa's economy will remain a low-growth economy. We will not create many jobs. A vast share of people will be jobless. And in that number, there will always be potential for radical populists to flip us out of being a democracy into some sort of terrible alternative. Secondly, the generous support that America offers, American taxpayers, you must remember, offers South Africa will probably go away. And that's just not just the USAID money, and which sometimes in South Africa's case was used in a manner, I think, to obstruct South Africa's progress, or the PEPFAR funds, which are back in operation again. But South Africa has run for several years, usually a substantial trade surplus with the US. It doesn't run a surplus with almost anywhere else that's serious. That's a gift from the United States to South Africa. And that will probably be taken away. And if our national security actions, whatever those are not the extent to which it's viewed as a threat, if that doesn't change, then there may be further actions, such as targeted sanctions, against individuals, perhaps even institutions, financial institutions that might have been party to transactions they shouldn't have been party to. And at the end of that road, there might be other things, such as some sort of action on American financial institutions buying South African government debt, in which case we face a very serious problem. We don't borrow heavily in foreign currency, but a lot of foreigners buy our debt. And if that is if a stop is put to that, it might not be that extreme, there are consequences. So it's not to say that if you ignore the American offer or bat it away, that you go back to a wonderful situation of success and prosperity. Just to hammer the point home, Trump and Musk, a colleague of mine puts it so well, are the richest and the most powerful people in the world, the two of them. They have been successful in their lives. They've taken some time out of those lives to offer South Africa advice, which is, in practice, if you cut out the fluff and everything, in the country's best long-term interest, and is advice that could save the ANC from what might otherwise happen to it. You know, the country's response to that, in being dismissive of it at best and being rude about it at worst, is perhaps the most useful insight you can get into why it is that somewhere with our potential grows its economy at 1% and has a 30% unemployment rate. You should perhaps say to them, you know, thanks for thinking of us. Let's think this through with you, and maybe there's something here we can work with.
Because as I've said before, we are choosing. South Africa chooses to be poor. We could choose to be rich.
I would agree with you.
It would be a very a simple thing to do. Let's go just a final point on the bigger picture. There's many people in commentators, politicians, etc., that are looking for what did they call it in World War II? They were always talking about the search for the super weapon that would win the war, especially when the Germans were starting to lose the war. And they kept on selling to the public, keep fighting because we've got a super weapon on the way. And the super weapon that South Africa and our politicians and our commentators seem to be holding on for is for China and Russia to swoop in, and India perhaps to swoop in and say, to hell with you, America, we are going to take South Africa's side and we'll fight with you, so take them on. You know, a little bit like a version of what must have happened with the ICJ case, where somebody comes in from the outside and says, we don't think you're useful idiots. We'll support you. We'll just do it quietly in the back.
Well, if they can take the fixed investment rate from 15 to 30% of GDP, then on balance, that would be very good for the country.
Yes. Do you see it happening?
Well, I don't think Russia has the firepower to achieve that.
Right. Which
I also think Russia is going to do a deal in practice with the Americans on Ukraine, which means and that the American strategy on Russia will be to use it as a bulwark against China. And therefore the peculiar position is created where Trump and Putin are, slightly exaggerate, but Trump and Putin are essentially aligned. But the ANC's run off to the EU to ask for protection against Trump.
Yeah.
So the ANC ends up allied with the EU and Trump ends up allied with Putin.
Yeah.
Not quite that, but you see the absurdity of it. The Chinese, I think, think South Africa is too volatile, too free, too democratic, and too expensive at this stage to pick it up as an asset. So I don't think if you shop around, and I mean, one cabinet minister suggested we go to Iran. I don't think that will deliver the requisite financial flows. So I think you can shop around as the ANC or whoever it is, and you can look for alternatives, but you're not going to find one. And there's always this lesson in the ANC that it seems to sometimes forget, that in its first decade or 15 years as a government, it did very well politically. Its support a decade into government was higher than when Mandela led it to freedom. It was 70% almost in the 2004 election. Mandela did 63. It's 6 points up, 10%. At the time, if you bother to look, the rate of growth in the economy was ramping upwards. We'd almost doubled the number of people in employment by that stage. You'd cut debt to GDP in half. Wait till you see the horrors that await in the budget later today, if we get that far. To the budget. The ANC was securing the first surpluses, fiscal surpluses, sustained surpluses since the formation of the Union of South Africa. They were, in other words, behaving in many respects as a government in quite a sensible way, and people rewarded that, and their support went up. And then they kind of lost the plot, and they went through the very difficult era of Mr. Zuma, and they became populist. They were going to nationalize healthcare and all sorts of things. And we had the mining charter. Remember, that chased the last of the greenfields mining out of the country. And we had NHI and expropriation without compensation. And on the flip side of that, the growth rate went down to nothing. The debt went up to where it is the largest, essentially the largest item of expenditure. We spend more now on servicing debt than we do on healthcare or crime and security or education. And ANC voter support fell to 40%. If it wishes to save itself, and I think that's quite important now, given what we've seen in the opposition's efforts to govern the country. If the ANC wishes to save itself, the track record of what works and what South Africa's people want is there. They're not after some wild revolutionary objective to seize the commanding heights. Rank and file, ordinary South Africans, and I can speak with authority because we do this work, the polling, all the time through the Social Research Foundation that I chair. Ordinary South Africans are pragmatic, centrist people. They want good schools for their kids. They want to own their homes. They want to work for investment banks. They want to have private medical insurance, not nationalized private medical insurance. And it is only because the ANC seems to have lost sight of that for much of the last decade that it is in this political predicament. And if it gains sight of what it's fond of speaking of our people, but it doesn't seem to understand them very well. If it develops a better understanding, will realize that the route to future ANC political dominance of South Africa is straightforward. And the inflection point to that is these very powerful and very rich Americans who have themselves a strategic vested interest in building sound relations with South Africa to safeguard their own geostrategic interests.
You don't think, because quite clearly they're making a different calculation. They're making the calculation of you add our 40% that we got in the last election to MK's 15%. In other words, we take over their policies. We take over the EFF's 10%, their policies. Collapse those two, and suddenly we're sitting back at 65%.
Well, you'd get back again, but you were once there on your own. And the only reason you're not there on your own anymore is that people lost confidence in you. And so they went around and looked at some of the alternatives. And those alternatives caused you a hell of a headache. And you did lose control of the country and everything that's included with that. And it is therefore incorrect. It's a strategic mistake to think that if you continue governing in the way that caused those people to leave you in the first place, that they will later return and be loyal. They will continue to seek alternatives, and you will continue to have a headache as a serious one, as a consequence of that. And that the shortest route back to success is to replicate what happened in the first decade and a bit, where you actually governed in a manner that met the expectations of people in the country.
Okay, so let's talk about the governing now, because we spent a lot of time talking about the ANC.
Oh.
But the ANC aren't the government anymore.
Well, they are entirely the government.
Yes, but I'm saying they carry, and it's the old story of, if you lie down with those dogs, you're going to get the fleas as well, right? I'm saying, at what point do we hold the government of national unity in its entirety as it's set up? They signed the piece of paper. They all said, we're now all on the same side.
You do it right away. The reason I say the ANC is in charge is is that I think there are people in the ANC who have been amazed at how easy it has been to just govern as if they'd never lost an election with their GNU compatriots sort of paving the way in many respects. So that's why I say the ANC still governs the country. It's still ANC, but ANC hasn't had to adjust on anything. Almost.
It hasn't, but I'm saying those other parties have collapsed their brand into the ANC.
They have to some extent. There's a ding-dong battle going on as we speak. This is budget day in South Africa today, and there's a serious conflict raging over whether certain opposition parties will back the budget at all, and they're demanding concessions. So it's the first hard fight, as we speak, first hard fight that there's been. But to that point, until that point, the opposition had been very obliging towards the ANC, and the ANC had continued. And that's Molethi Mbeki's point, as I understood it from that YouTube clip, that the tragedy of the GNU is that the partners actually have a lot of common ground, and so there's no one to drive key reform. So therefore, yes, you must be critical of the GNU. And you must be wary of doing a thing that is, there's relief at the GNU, as there should be, because the alternative at the time, in that crisis period, ANC's got 40%, didn't entirely see that coming. And we know because we showed them and then they told us they didn't believe it. So that was a shocking moment in the crisis period. They could have gone anywhere, run off with the EFF and MK. We'd be talking about a very different country today. So the GNU was at the time, and I was a strong supporter of it, absolutely the right thing to do. And I think the parties that put it together across all sides, the ANC side, the DA side, John Steenhuisen at the time did very well. And we can be very grateful for what they did there. It was a great deal to make. However, subsequently, what you've done with the GNU has been simply to continue the trajectory of before the GNU. Now, in some sense, the DA has justified that on the basis of its very clever campaign idea of doomsday. That if we didn't do this, it'd be doomsday, so stop bitching at us now, because if we weren't there, you'd be at doomsday. Now, the two very bright chaps run a think tank policy group kind of place called Sakelicha, Piet Leroux and Russell Lamberti, you should certainly have here. And they made the point to me that the trouble with the doomsday thing might work very well politically and in the media, is that doomsday is kind of a spectrum. There's no cut-off point at which you were not at doomsday and now you are. And because doomsday is a kind of obtuse thing and kind of hard, what is doomsday? You might say it's 1% economic growth, 30% unemployment's doomsday, or Gaza is doomsday. And because it can be any of those things, the ANC can push and push and push the DA closer and closer to doomsday, to within a millimetre of whatever it is. And the DA, by its own logic, cannot leave the government to hold the ANC to account because it says we are fending off doomsday from happening. So the DA, in that respect, in struggling to initially define clear limits and using the immense political power that it had, because politics is about power, not about making friends and finding common ground, getting together, mutual understanding, having national dialogues, all crap. It's nothing to do with politics. Politics is about power. And the DA's failure to employ the power that it had in joining the GNU to define at some point when doomsday started and when it didn't, meant that the ANC could push it around. It pushed it very far as a consequence. And I think it will suffer significant voter damage as a consequence of that. The DA. Significant voter damage. And look closely at it. The Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, Bella, it's a DA minister forced to enforce that. And Bella's a bad piece of legislation because in 1996 South Africa introduced the Schools Act. The Schools Act gave parents far more control over schools than had previously been the case, which is a very good thing. Bella, in its entirety, you can quibble clause by clause, reduces parental involvement over schools. It's exactly what you should not do if you ever want to fix schools, because parental involvement is a critical element in ensuring that schools function, for the simple fact that parents care more about their kids than bureaucrats and politicians do. So the DA will now enforce this. It will quibble about a clause here and there. And that's also just crap. Because even if the DA minister can rewrite a clause, the next minister can unwrite that clause again, and because the law is fundamentally bad. Then the DA is given the Expropriation Act. Their minister is responsible for that. It isn't by accident that the two most... And the Expropriation Act is very bad for the reasons I've set out. Not nil, not land, slight red herrings. It's bad because an investor who would come to me to say, let's do the due diligence on South Africa, when it comes to the question of expropriation, I could not tell them how much they would get if they were expropriated. And there's nothing called the Land Expropriation Act. All fixed and movable property can go for less than its market value. And that just shuts the door on the requisite levels of capital investment. But the DA has been given this hand grenade without a pin to implement in government. It is not an accident that these things landed on the desks of DA ministers. And the ANC, who are good at playing power politics, very good, have thereby created a situation where the DA feels it is in crisis and has had to turn internally to try and shore up what is its sliding voter support base, instead of focusing on the questions of the government, holding the ANC to account and promoting policy reform in the country broadly. They have been played by people who are better at this sort of thing than they are. And they have suffered severe damage as a consequence of that.
So what is to be done? What is the advice? Do you make a stand, and the place to make a stand would probably be at the budget?
I would say the budget is a very serious thing, obviously. Because one of the pillars that South Africa has been able to present to investors as a sort of shining light of stability is that we have an excellent Treasury Department with, except for a few blupses in the Zuma era, very good finance ministers who do very well to manage the finances, given that they're handed this hospital pass of the growth rate. And Mr. Godongwana has been excellent throughout his term. We don't borrow heavily. Debt is, we try and, you'll see later today, it's slightly lost at this time. It's not his fault. And investors have known that the budget is done by sensible people, very important, and that it passes through Parliament easily. If an uncertainty is hung on the budget now, we are doing damage to one of the few, regrettably, things that we could show to if you go to talk in London somewhere and they say, well, what is it? Why? You can say, look at the budget process. Absolutely world-class, sensible, pragmatic, done correctly, absolutely stable. There's now a question about that. Balanced against the view that the ANC has taken great liberties with the DA. And as the DA capitulated on issue after issue, the ANC, of course, became ever more confident that we'll just push them around everywhere. And if indeed there is an issue on the budget today that cannot be resolved, the ANC might be accused of having overplayed its hand and gone too far, and the DA, sensing the loss of support, desperate to indicate to its supporters that we're not just a doormat into the government. I called them that on Alec Hogg's show a week or so ago. Wasn't very popular in the DA. That we're not a doormat. They want to take a strong stand, and they're doing it possibly on the budget now. But I think the problem isn't that. It's not taking a stand here or there. I think there's an institutional problem, frankly, around the Democratic Alliance. It's not enough of a meritocracy. It doesn't have enough high-caliber people. Part of the reason is that for 20 years, wealthy elites in South Africa saw no need to invest in it because they didn't foresee what was going to happen in the country's politics. And that where the DA performance in the government has been weak, it has been a function of its structures and the caliber of many of its people. There are, of course, exceptional individuals. And that if the DA wishes to have another run at this at a future point in time and be more successful, you've got to address the institutional weaknesses inside that party. You can't do it through a few firm actions here and there in the hope that the damage you're suffering will be mitigated as a consequence.
So, Frans, just in wrapping up that, the picture looks very uncertain. The GNU looks like it could be, at a precarious space. South Africa's choices, we're faced with a very potentially positive outcome to the Trump situation, or a positively disastrous outcome to the Trump situation for South Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right, yeah.
So all of these factors together, what are you telling people who are saying to you, what the hell is going on in South Africa?
I mentioned Alec, and I was on his show a week ago. And I was extremely worried because the reaction to Trump was so immensely hostile, and stupidly so, given the opportunity inside it, and the internal politics was. I'll write a book one day. Frightening. Subsequent to that, a few conversations later, I will answer your question frankly. The best thing that could happen now would be for the ANC to get back to its 50% plus majority, because I don't think the opposition is of the ability to succeed in national government well, with exceptions. I'm talking about the country's welfare. And with that, you need to do both things. Send the right signals to the US to say we want a deal where we can get the fixed investment rate up. That the DA goes back into opposition, where it is skilled and effective. These are different roles, these. And holds the government to account, which it has done so very well for so long, failing which many problems from state capture onwards would never have drawn the public attention and criticism that they did. The ANC, I think, is on its way there in its data. We'll see later this week. The potential to strike that deal with the Americans is there. It's just a question of doing it. Don't know if it will happen. And that may now be the... So I'm not sitting on the fence, therefore, for you. That chain of events may now be the most practical and pragmatic chain of events that are necessary for South Africa to, in the longer term, become a successful middle-income economy while remaining a chiefly free and open society.
Do we have more than a 50-50 chance of this coming to pass?
I don't know. It's very hard to say.
Tough one to call. So.
It's very, very hard to say now. The most critical thing, perhaps, is do we read the signals from Washington to do a deal? You see, if that happens in and of itself, it's an external inflection point on reform, opening the economy to much higher levels of investment. You're raising the growth rate. That takes the ANC above 50, calms tensions domestically. I might say to you that if you want to watch one indicator, it's whether within the next few months, if you want to see a sharp upward turn, whether in the next few months there's a meeting in the Rose Garden.
Yes. Well, I think there's going to be quite a few meetings in the Rose Garden. Frans Cronje, we are going to ask you a few questions from our community. But in the meantime, to everybody that's joined us today, support our sponsors, Pace Car Rental. They keep us on air. Subscribe, like the channel. We are growing nicely. Let's keep it going. And thank you so much to Frans Cronje for joining us today, and to everybody that watched us. Thank you, and we'll see you soon on the State of the Nation. If you want to watch more of this great interview, join our community.